Hey there, I'm Jim Schwartz, an Adult Services Assistant for Spartanburg County Public Libraries, and today we're going to talk to you about someone who's not really known but is an influential figure in the civil rights movement and in gay rights movement, Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was born on March 17, 1912 in Westchester, Pennsylvania. His mother, Florence, was only 17 at the time of his birth, and Rustin's father left during Florence's pregnancy. Because of this, Bayard was raised by his maternal grandparents, Jennifer and Julia Rustin, and was believed that Florence was his sister until he was 10 years old. Julia, a dedicated Quaker, modeled her life after the virtues of nonviolence, racial justice, and community service, and made sure to raise Bayard with these same goals. Despite this, Bayard's life in Westchester was dominated by segregation and local opposition to equality, with the small town even having its own branch of the Ku Klux Klan. This dissonance forced Bayard to take an early stance in his life, with him joining his grandmother at protests and eventually leading his own, pushing against the segregated accommodations that black student athletes had to deal with during out-of-town games. After graduating high school in 1930, Rustin attended Wilberforce University and later City College of New York, neither of which he graduated from, but this move to New York City helped connect him to the activism that he would find to be his calling. After organizing support for the Scottsboro Boys, a group of teenagers in Scottsboro, Alabama, who had been accused of raping two white women, Rustin joined the American Communist Party and worked as a part of the Young Communist League until 1941, when, under the advisement of Asa Phillips Randolph, Rustin left the political party and joined the Fellowship of Reconciliation, rising to become their race relations secretary. Randolph, a noted labor unionist and civil rights activist, was a prominent figure in the early days of the civil rights movement and had founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, an African-American railroad workers union that pushed for more equal racial and economic statuses between railroad workers. And Rustin, with his help, planned a 1941 March on Washington to protest racial discrimination within the armed forces. However, the March on Washington was canceled by FDR's issuing of an executive order that banned racial discrimination in the defense industry and the federal government, which Randolph took as a victory, but Rustin saw as not going far enough since it only banned discrimination within defense contractors rather than within the armed forces as a whole. Right after this, in 1942, Rustin, along with two other members of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, founded the Congress of Racial Equity, where Rustin became the treasurer. However, soon after this, Rustin was arrested and placed in prison for 3 years after refusing to be drafted into the army, claiming religious issues with killing. This only gave him time to think, though, and soon after his release in 1947, Rustin organized the Journey of Reconciliation. The Journey of Reconciliation was a joint venture between the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the Congress of Racial Equity, and was a multi-state test of a recent Supreme Court decision that forbade racial discrimination in interstate transportation. Racially integrated teams of protesters boarded buses in North Carolina, blacks sitting in the front, which was set aside for whites only, and whites sitting in the back, which was the black section of the bus. State and local police arrested Rustin and numerous others, and Rustin spent a month in jail and was sent out to work on a chain gang during this time. However, Rustin couldn't capitalize too much on the momentum of the notoriety that the Journey of Reconciliation had brought him, as in 1953, Rustin was arrested in Pasadena, California for sex perversions after being found having sex in a car with two other men. The fallout from this charge forced Rustin to resign from the Fellowship of Reconciliation, pushing Rustin out of the normal spheres of influence for labor and civil rights activists and into spheres that would lead him to what some scholars call his greatest accomplishment. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery for refusing to give up her seat on the bus to a white passenger, which started the Montgomery bus boycott, a protest that ran for over a year and attracted national attention to the South in the attempts to fight segregation. Bayard Rustin traveled to Montgomery to be able to lend his expertise in Gandhian tactics, using nonviolence as a protest in order to be able to win more support for their cause. However, Rustin was not able to give much advice to the protest, as news of his arrival leaked out, and Rustin, because of his association with the Young Communist League and his arrest in 1953, Rustin was asked by King and other local leaders, along with Asa Phillips Randolph, to leave Montgomery and work behind the scenes in New York, organizing support for the Montgomery bus boycott in the North. This organization in Montgomery would connect Rustin with Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who is the rising star of the civil rights movement, and capitalizing on this, Rustin helped write the original manifest for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, stressing that the organization would be guided by Christian principles in order to make the fledgling group less vulnerable to charges of radicalism and communism. During some of the first meetings of the SCLC, Rustin pushed for them and for King himself to adopt Gandhian nonviolent tactics when addressing segregation, allowing for more neutral-leaning people to be able to support the actions of the conference. Rustin also took a personal interest in pushing King to the forefront of the civil rights movement. Adam Farlow writes that throughout 1957, 1958, and 1959, Rustin worked quietly in the background to polish King's image as the evangelist of nonviolent resistance. They helped King with his speeches, they scrutinized his articles and arranged for their publication, they gave editorial assistance on Strike Towards Freedom. Even when thus burnished, King's prose tended to be dull, flat, and platitudinous. Rustin not only proffered literary assistance, but also arranged speaking engagements and helped to introduce King to people and organizations across the liberal spectrum. Harris Wofford recalled at this period that Rustin seemed ever present with advice and sometimes acted as if King were a precious puppet whose symbolic actions were to be planned by a Gandhian high command. Rustin also agreed at this time to serve as a part-time public relations director. However, as a caveat to his employment, if anything about Rustin's past associations or homosexuality came to light, Rustin would quietly resign. This time working closely with King would shortly end, though, as in 1960, Rustin was forced to quietly resign from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference when Adam Clayton Powell Jr. threatened to publicly identify the two men as lovers. While privately tolerant of homosexuality, King saw that as one of the largest threats to the legitimacy of the civil rights movement's acceptance within the current American society and King's image as a whole, so Rustin was quietly pushed to the side. This wasn't the end of Rustin's work in the civil rights movement or with King, because under the advice of Asa Phillips Randolph, Rustin was brought in as the deputy director of what would become the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. However, despite this lower title, Rustin threw himself into the job, planning and organizing civil rights groups around the country to be able to merge their resources and bring even more national attention to the momentum of the civil rights movement. In an interview with journalists, Randolph referred to Rustin as Mr. March on Washington himself and refused to even consider having anyone other than Rustin lead the organization of such a movement. As a final attempt to try to attack the march, Senator Strom Thurmond attacked Rustin for being both a communist and a pervert on the floor of the Senate, but leaders of the SCLC, Philip Randolph, and King all rallied to Rustin's defense, praising his abilities and achievements. Along with the March on Washington, Rustin also founded the organization In Friendship, which was a collaboration to help support victims of racial terror who had lost their jobs and homes due to their activities fighting for civil rights, and became a prominent figure within the civil rights movement once again, being compared at times to be the equal of Martin Luther King. As his stances became more solidified and mainstream, the FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, began spying on Rustin, trying to catch him as a communist sympathizer due to his past associations and professional contacts with the New York Communist Party leaders, even though Rustin had left the party and expressed ideological differences with communism. As part of his pacifist nature, Rustin was anti-war, opposing the draft and serving his jail sentence for refusing to enlist during World War II, and it tied racial issues to the war effort afterwards. However, with the United States struggling with the effort to contain communism during the Vietnam War, Rustin opposed tying calls to peace to the civil rights movement, fearing it would dilute the message and that it would be used by opponents to denounce and push back against his civil rights legislation. This move was seen as cowardly and lost Rustin respect among civil rights leaders, especially among the younger generation who opposed what they saw as Rustin's attempt to form coalitions of liberal and moderate whites to act alongside black leaders. Despite his refusal to fully call for peace in Vietnam, Rustin did lead programs to help refugees of war from Vietnam and Cambodia, and worked with programs to end apartheid in South Africa, both of which he saw as a front in the civil rights movement, not just for Americans, but for the world. Along with that, in the 1980s, under the urging from his partner, Rustin began pushing for gay rights in the United States, seeing them as suffering under the same conditions as African Americans, and stating that the barometer of where one is on human rights is no longer the black community, it is the gay community, because it is the community which is most easily mistreated. However, Rustin never fully worked with the gay rights movement, seeing it as a private matter and one that he preferred not to comment on, and one that affected him less than his race. Bayard Rustin died on August 24th, 1987 in New York City. He had spent most of his life striving towards equality for all and calling out any who attempted to stop the march of progress for civil rights. However, due to his sexuality, Rustin had faded from the stories and books on the civil rights movement, left out and pushed to the back in favor of others who were seen as more acceptable and socially conforming. The fame was never Bayard's goal, though. He left a legacy in his works and his impact with the communities which he worked tirelessly for. In 2013, Rustin was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition for his work, with President Obama stating that Rustin was an unyielding activist for civil rights, dignity, and equality for all. An advisor to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., he promoted nonviolent resistance, participated in one of the first freedom rides, organized the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and fought tirelessly for marginalized communities at home and abroad. As an openly gay African American, Mr. Rustin stood at the intersection of several of the fights for equal rights. This was just a short summary of Bayard's life and doesn't begin to cover the many other causes he found himself involved in, all of which are a fascinating look into the struggles for the civil rights movement and as a African American and a gay man in the early to mid 20th century. Books on Bayard Rustin are hard to find, and we have some in our system, but most of the references in this come from our databases, most especially the African American History Database and Academic Source Premier, both of which led me to unique and useful sources that allowed for a more in-depth look at Bayard Rustin's life.